All right, so just for the record, on video with my voice talking directly into the microphone now, you do not need to believe this. You need to understand and know it. You do not need to believe this. You believe whatever the heck you want. But you need to know this. When I ask you questions about this, you need to know the answer to those questions. Right? Okay. So as we talk about this, the question was, what are the common thoughts and issues that kind of surround evolution? Some of the controversial aspects of it, or some of the things that make people think I can't believe in that theory. That doesn't line up. What are some of the things that are out there about evolution that you already know or that? Your essential question is, how did the ideas of scientists preceding, that means coming before, Charles Darwin, that's the guy who published the theory of evolution, inform his theory. So how did the ideas of scientists preceding Charles Darwin inform his theory? How did they help him come up with this theory? And below that, here, you can see the date that you've got to have your test retaken by. Anything less than an A, and your deadline is the 24th of April. Charles Darwin. And this guy was 1800. So if you go back then, if we do a little, think to your history class or think what you know about this point in time, 200, 300 years ago, what was the most accepted thought of how old the Earth was? Yeah, it was the biblical one, right? 5,000 to 6,000 years old. That was the idea. In his theory here, with his theory that he came up with, he was also a very religious man, and the timeline he believed in was that 5,000 or 6,000 year timeline. But he struggled to make all the changes that happened in animals over time fit in that 5,000 to 6,000 year time frame. It didn't work as part of his theory. And so some of the things we're going to go over here explain how the time frame shifted and what a monumental idea that was. Because you can look back further in time to Galileo, who was the first person to suggest that the Earth wasn't the center of the solar system, but that the sun was. And do you remember what happened to him when he made that suggestion? He was excommunicated from the Catholic Church. His books were turned into heresy, so you couldn't possess one of his books anymore, and he was made to renounce his ideas. So the church was still very much in the forefront of everyone's thought at this point in time. And this theory he comes up with still conflicts with church teachings. Number one, for the age of the earth. Number two, for the church says we were designed this way. And he says, well, maybe not so much. So it was a big deal for him to publish this because he was very concerned. In fact, he had it ready to go for about 13 years before he did anything with it because he was nervous about it. So these ideas that we'll look at here are the ideas that helped him piece together this idea of evolution, which is that animals change over time. That's the idea of evolution. So the first one we'll talk about here is this man. His name is Charles Lyell. This is the first guy that was there that influenced his position. And this guy took a look at places like this. Obviously, this is in Utah, but he looked at other places and saw that the Earth changes over time. You can look at the Grand Canyon, and every year it gets just a little bit deeper. You can look at mountains that climb higher a little bit every year, or continents that move a couple inches every year. Volcanoes erupt. And he said that the Earth changes over long periods of time. Right? Before that point in time, people just assumed, what was here on Earth, this mountain over here, this volcano over here, this island, was there always and was always going to be there. The Earth was assumed to be a permanent fixed station. This guy was the first one to come up, this geologist, Charles Lyell, was the first one to come up with the idea that Earth actually changes over time. And Darwin took that and said, oh, well, if the Earth changes over time, probably makes sense that the animals that live there on the Earth have to change when the Earth changes. If it gets hotter, the animals are going to have to adjust to it. If it gets colder, the animals are going to have to adjust to it. So that was the first bit of information that helped influence his theory. We got was our next geologist, our second of two geologists that we'll look at here. And this is the fella, James Hutton is his name, that suggested, based on Lyell's theory, that if stuff changes, he said that the Earth is probably not thousands of years old. He looked at the rate of change that was occurring. And, if things change slowly each year, he said there's no way it's possible that the Earth has only been around for 5,000 or 6,000 years if all these changes have occurred to it. It has to have been around for longer than that. And that was his main contribution. He gave Darwin the time frame to work within. Before this, Darwin was struggling to fit all these animal changes into that 5,000 or 6,000 year period. This guy turned out to be wrong based on what we think now. But he said the Earth is probably millions of years old rather than thousands of years old. And science now, do you remember from last year how old scientists think the Earth is now? Yeah, like 4.5 billion. So this guy still wasn't right based on what we think now, but he gave a much more accurate picture of how old it was. And that allowed for the changes Darwin saw happening in animals to be spread out over a time frame that made sense. His name was Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. He was a French scientist. And he had the first theory of evolution that was out there. And his theory was interesting, but it ultimately proved not true. His theory was interesting because he said that over the course of your life, by using stuff or not using stuff, you gained or lost traits that you could pass on. So, for example, he thought if you were a bodybuilder and you developed like really gigantic muscles over the course of your life, that you got to pass those on to your kids. If you got really smart over the course of your life, you'd get to pass on your high intelligence to your kids. If you got your arm chopped off in some kind of weird accident, then your kids would not have the arm, and stuff got passed down. Ultimately, it proved not to be true. But he was the first one that helped Darwin understand this, that favorable traits, things that are good, get passed on more often than unfavorable traits, things that don't really help you. So things that help you get passed on more often than things that don't. And he was the first person to propose that idea. And Darwin used that to help explain how evolution works. So 2,000 years ago, we had about 300 million people on Earth when Christ was born. And for a very long period of time, for 1,000 years, it only went up by 10 million people in 1,000 years. In the next 500 years, it went up by about 200 million people. It went up very slowly, and sometime right around here, is that like the Industrial Revolution time in the late 1800s or so, human population on Earth has gone basically in a vertical pattern, almost straight up, to now where we're over 7.6 billion people, I think is where we're at now, here on Earth. So, there was an economist, his name was Thomas Malthus, and he said that in populations not related to humans, so he wasn't talking about humans, but he said that resources on Earth are limited. And by resources, he meant like food and water and places to live, and that eventually there's not going to be enough to go around. Like as the population of animals grow, they're going to run out of water to drink. They're going to run out of places to live. They're going to run out of food to eat. And it's that limit, they call it limiting factors, the food, water, habitat. Those limitations will dictate like how big a population can get. Right? It only makes sense. If there's only 20 gallons of water to be drank, 20 gallons of water to be drank, then that's only enough to support so many people, right? And if there's enough people there and they need 21 gallons of water, somebody's not going to make it. Who's going to be the one that doesn't make it? Yeah. So sometimes it's called like weaker and stronger. In terms of evolution, it's fittest and least fit. So the one that is not going to survive is going to be the one that is the least fit, the one that can't adjust to the environment as well. Makes sense, doesn't it? That there's only so much stuff. Human population for a very long period of time was limited by like factors that involved like food and access to clean, healthy living environments and stuff like that. But right around here, that changed. So we're in this period of like basically vertical exponential growth. And at some point in time, that has to end, right? There can be no like human growth into infinity. You can't get to infinity. we're going to either A, run out of room on Earth for people to live, B, run out of places to grow food for people to eat, or C, run out of like clean water for people to drink. So at some point, this human population is going to like curve over, right? It's going to kind of flatten out again. We're going to reach a maximum sustainable population. We'll learn about that. It's called carrying capacity in ecology. But we'll reach like a maximum population. At that point in time, it's going to be a struggle. You're going to have to, there's not going to be enough food to go around. There's not going to be enough water to have. And the people that survive are going to be the ones that are the most fit. Not fit like in shape, but fit as in like possess the most traits that help them survive.
Exactly how much sugar could possibly hold?
No, I think it changes depending on like technology and things like that. As we develop better technology to farm and to house people and things like that, it's a ratio of like how much land we need per person to grow their food changes.
Right now, we're living around like 18 million or something.
Billion.
Or billion.
Yeah.
18 billion.
But at some point, we're going to get there. We're going to bump up against that, like, oh no, we've got too many people on Earth, and now something bad's going to happen. It happens in animal populations. You can see it. Like the deer, elk, whatever, all the animal populations that we like to hunt or that we like to look at in the woods are all relatively stable. Their population doesn't have like giant peaks and then big losses unless there's like a weird winter or something like that. They're pretty stinking stable, and that's because the habitat is full. There are as many animals that live there as can live there, and for every one that's born, basically another one dies because it takes its place. Things die off as they get old, and that frees up a little habitat for the new ones to come in and take it over. But that's the idea. Human population, or this helped Darwin realize that when there are limited resources, only the ones that are really fit are the ones that get to survive. Right? If there's one steak left, and if it's the difference between Miss Wilson and I surviving, I love you, Miss Wilson, in a totally school-appropriate way, but I'm going to get you. I'm going to eat that steak, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure it's me that survives and not you. No offense. But that's kind of the way evolution works. It works that way in the wild. If you're a wild animal and you're competing over a food source, you can see lions defend their territory because that's where they eat. They're not necessarily competing over the land. They're competing over the right to survive. They'll fight other things, other animals for that so that they control that and that they can survive. That's the idea behind it. So those are you grab this sheet of paper, and like if you flip it, it's got different stuff on either side. Seems like it'd be something really easy to do, but for someone with dyslexia, this took me about 25 minutes to put together to get the like spacing and the thing right, to have it the way I wanted it. So it looks really easy, but you'll have to take my word that it was not really easy for me to do. So here's what I want you to do with this thing. I want you to take it and fold it exactly in half so that you get the words on the outside of the fold like that. And if you need the paper, it's right here. So you want to take it, fold it in half so you get the words on the outside like that. So it's going to look like that. And then on the inside, when you open it up, you'll just have these blanks right there. This thing's going to be what goes on page 41 inside of your notebook here. So once you've got that fold made, here's what I was thinking. That each of these things aren't necessarily vocab words. They're also like important things, concepts, or names that you need to know. So as you're doing this, you are going to cut along these horizontal black lines that are here. So not through both pieces of paper, but just through one. So you're going to cut like a flap right there along that black line to the center so that you're creating like a flap to pull over like that. And when you're done, you'll have all these individual flaps that'll look like broom bristles or something like that. And here's what I want you to put on the, as you open this up, and I'll have to tear it because I don't have scissors right here. But as you have the flap like this, on the outside is the name, Charles Lyell. Here on the inside, it doesn't have to be a picture. It can be some kind of device that's going to help you remember what the important thing is over here, right? So some kind of, like, Charles Lyell was responsible. Here's what Charles Lyell did over here in the, like, the lined part. Here's whatever trick. Picture would work fine, or mnemonic device, some way you're going to remember it over here. So that when you're done, you've got a study guide that kind of looks like this. Here's the name. Here's the thing that's going to help you remember it. here is the actual thing you have to remember right there. Make sense for you guys? Okay. So what I'd like you to do today is get through natural variation, which is a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1 down. So we've got somewhere in like this 18-minute range or something like that. If you can make it through natural variation, then you're going to be on track. This thing is not homework. We'll work on it little bits here and there in class, and if we don't get to it in class, the due date for this will be this Friday. So this thing done by Friday on page 41 in your interactive notebook. Work for you guys? All right, I've got scissors over there on the end. I've got crayons over there on the end too, and you guys just got to make it through natural variation.